Hello everyone and welcome to this video. In this video I'll reflect, and this will be quite a reflective video, on the problematic aspects of social media and the, let's say, vis-a-vis the problematic aspects of the ego in general, right? So the way I see it, and I'll argue from the standpoint of psychoanalyst Carl Jung, who's a Swiss psychoanalyst, worked around the turn of the 20th century. And so I'll argue from a psychological standpoint, but then more specifically from the standpoint of psychoanalyst Carl Jung, who has a very particular view on the psyche, which I'll try to briefly introduce in this video. And I have a lot of videos on Jung on my channel. The whole channel is dedicated to these topics around Jungian psychoanalysis and the potential emancipation it offers us, but also the problematics of the psyche it highlights. But in particular, I'll be talking about, in this video, the natural process of ego development and then how it's let's say, amplified on social media. And I'll try to keep this video short, so I'll try to keep it under 10 minutes. Again, it's introductory. If you're interested in this material, please consider to subscribe. And of course, leave a comment and let me know what you think. And let me know if I should do a more in-depth video on this topic. So, beginning with the problematic of the ego in general. The ego in general, apologies, I have to write down timestamps. The ego in general, the ego for Jung essentially is the core of the psyche. So the psyche is comprised of different complexes for Jung, and the ego sits at the core of those. This means the ego basically dictates the other complexes, so the other, let's say, centers, potential centers, how they should be interpreted, right? It dictates us, so that which essentially perceives the ego, listens to the ego. There's a difference between those and Jung, implicitly. The narrative, the kind of story that it should tell to oneself and to others. Now, the to others part is considered a separate aspect, so that's the persona. Now, the natural process in which the ego is always engaged is going out into the world, perceiving certain, let's say, elements, and then making up its own mind about what they are, so interpreting them. And this interpretation is based on the sort of pre-existent fundament, so the already existent narrative structure of the ego, and then situating those interpreted elements within this narrative structure to then create a linear projection into the future, right? So it essentially always goes like, okay, well, there's this dog, it just bit another dog, it doesn't really matter to me, dogs are evil, I knew dogs were evil, I'm just gonna go on with life. Now, the problem is that in making these generalizations, the ego subjugates what is generally considered autonomous elements. And these autonomous elements are basically existent components of reality that are not ego, right? Again, ego only holds representations. Elements are dynamic entities, let's say, of moving reality, so to speak. The dog, even as an abstract phenomenon, is a still developing continuum, let's say, of particulars. The little dog that I saw yesterday at the grocery market, my father's dog, my mother's dog, whatever, The problem is that each of these particulars may or contribute to the general category of the dog, and thus may shape the interpretation of the category of the dog, right? And now what happens is that the ego essentially makes this interpretation of the dog, but the dog in itself is so multiplicit that if the ego encounters even a particular dog that it encountered yesterday again tomorrow, its interpretation of this dog may shift. And this precise shift is the natural process, let's say, in which the ego attempts to shape its interpretation of reality. The ego, however, is always concerned with, let's say, maintaining a rigidity in its interpretation, for the precise reason that this rigidity means stability. Because again, remember, the ego attempts to project in order to build a stable body of narrative with which you can move through the insane complexity of the world, okay? So the ego is always concerned with the process that I refer to as crystallization. Now this process is problematic because obviously reality continues to develop and unfold, right? The dog changes, and I encounter many dogs and not only one dog, and thus my interpretation may shift. But this is precisely why people are so prejudiced, right? About all kinds of things. It's like, oh, do you want to have coffee? Oh, I hate coffee. Coffee is disgusting. It's like, well, you've probably only had coffee at your grandmother's house when you were 12, and that's why you didn't like it, but now you don't like it at all. But this coffee is actually amazing. You know, something like that. Anyways, the wonderful thing, or the wonderful aspect of reality is that the ego is necessarily forced to continue its development because it encounters reality over and over again, unless in extreme and pathological cases, it withdraws entirely. This would be, you know, part of anxiety disorder is this withdrawal where you don't want to encounter because the ego is so fragile and scared of precisely the ruptures that reality brings with it, right? If we're not in this region, which we all are in part, right, a lot of encounter with very fundamental assumptions is very problematic even for the strongest ego. But for Carl Jung, essentially the large task in the first half of life, which is essentially everything leading up to what people call midlife crisis, this could be anywhere between 30 and 50, or maybe 60, is, for some people it doesn't happen, is developing a strong ego. Developing a strong sense of this is my position in the world and no one can harm it, right? However, not only in the second part of life, but also before, because Jung says there are all these micro processes of individuation, which we'll get to in other videos, the ego is always forced to comply or to compare its own assumptions of reality with the actual reality at hand. So this means that the dog that I have this interpretation of is always going to be challenged by the actual dog that I encounter. And this is precisely the value of reality, if you will. This is precisely the reason why, as I conceptualize it in other videos, the subject is a kind of mediator caught in an eternal struggle with that which we consider unconscious or that which we consider the world, the non-ego. Now we can finally get to social media and why it's problematic. Sorry, I always have to write down these timestamps. The problem on social media is that it cuts off the subject from precisely these encounters. Or to be more precise, it allows the subject to overwrite these encounters with simply looking at other content that then complies with its interpretation. First of all, the algorithms do all the work for us, right? They say, you only want to see videos on puppies and cats? Well, here are 1 billion videos on puppies and cats, right? The problem is that puppies and cats are not at all what you should be seeing, right? They paint a picture of the dog and the cat that is fundamentally unrealistic and has nothing to do with the actual encounter of this dog that has killed 10 of its cubs yesterday, you know, and that is the reality of this wild animal that we have somehow thought we tamed, right? This whole process of taming in itself is an insane act of ego hubris. You know, you think you can take this wild animal and turn it into a, you know, petable, cuddling teddy bear kind of thing. Well, you know, think again. Think again. Encounter a moment in which reality is called forth, and you'll see that you've made somewhat of a mistake there, right? But social media never really brings us into this position. It may show us a video of a wolf attacking some sheep, but this can always be interpreted away and say, oh, well, this is a wolf, you know, it has nothing to do with this cute little puppy that I've seen and that I think of when I'm talking about dogs, right? But the problem is a lot deeper than this, because we present ourselves on social media and constantly fall into this identification with being precisely this constant and projectable assumption that we have of ourselves, right? And then if we, in reality, encounter aspects of ourselves that do not comply with this image, we can immediately overwrite them by simply returning to the platform and saying, well, you know, actually I'm this and I'm that, and look at this picture, and so on and so forth. So social media essentially cuts off precisely this mediating movement. And I don't mean this on a metaphysical level. I also mean it on a metaphysical level, but in this precise video and in this precise context, I mean it on an individual mental health kind of level, right? Social media cuts off your possibility to have these soft encounters that you have every day, that based on which you can mold the image of reality you have. And the problem here is that it opens the door for a hard encounter. And this hard encounter is precisely the moment in which trauma may arise, in which a fundamental aspect of the ego may be encountered, may be shattered, and may leave a wound or a gap that is very difficult to bridge. Right? So the call, I think, in this video, that what I'm calling for is go out into the world, don't be afraid, and do that every day. Don't look away. Look the world into the eyes and don't look away, because it is precisely these small looks that will ultimately open up a space in which you can, let's say, come to terms with what actually is. Thanks for tuning in, and consider to subscribe again and leave your comment if you like this video, and I hope to see you around again.